Welcome back to Social Studies 20-1. Today we are looking at the Cold War again. This is our second episode of a Cold War timeline. In this episode, we're going to be going back over some of the key events of yesterday's lesson on the Cold War, and we're going to work our way towards the end of the war. So in the beginning, we saw that Harry S. Truman becomes president of the United States in 1945, and he and this man, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, who will be in power during the first era of the Cold War in the Soviet Union, they're going to have a personality conflict, and their conflict is going to help create the tension among these major powers, and help cause the Cold War. The four powers will divide Germany after World War II and denazify it. Yesterday we talked about this concept of the Soviets occupying Eastern Germany, and the Americans and their allies, the British and the French, occupying Western Germany. So the four allies, they have different zones of Germany, and they have the responsibility of denazifying them. And what we're going to see quite quickly is that they have different visions as to what to do with Germany. Whereas in the East, the Soviets are going to punish Germany and export much of the wealth from Germany in terms of war reparations. They're going to loot their factories. And in the West, the United States, the French and British, they're going to rebuild Germany. So we have a much stronger western part of Germany today than the eastern part as a consequence or legacy of this. We're also going to see that in the East, the Soviet Union will end up building a government in Berlin similar to the government in Moscow, a communist, authoritarian, one-party system, whereas in the West, we're going to see more of an American system. So even though that was never the plan to create two separate Germanys, it's a consequence of how they divided Germany at the end of the war to denazify it. Igor Gorzenko, September 1945. This is going to be one of those moments where the West realizes what kind of ally Stalin's Soviet Union has been during World War II. So Igor Gorzenko had been a clerk for the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And he's going to go down to CSIS in Canada, in Ottawa, and he's going to expose the fact that the Soviets had been spying upon their allies. And this is going to help create some red fear, right? Some red scare. So what happens in America is the U.S. President Truman, he's going to ask his diplomat in Moscow, a man named George Kennan, what kind of people are these Russians? And legend says that Kennan had a house party, and his Russian friends attended in Moscow, and some of them had left behind listening devices. And when he received a telegram from his president asking what kind of people are the Russians, Kennan felt very betrayed. And he said that these are aggressive and expansionist people, and the only language they understand is violence, and therefore we must contain them. So Kennan's long telegram will inspire the ideas of the containment policy, foreign policy of the Americans, which will shape the Truman Doctrine. Attached to this idea of the Truman Doctrine and the need for it is the Domino Theory. So we've allowed Russia to fall to communism. And because we allowed Russia to fall, other states bordering Russia have fallen. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they've fallen. Some states now in Eastern Europe have fallen. We've lost Poland, we've lost Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. And we need to stop the spread of communism. We need to contain it, or ultimately the last domino of the United States will fall from the pressure of all the other dominoes. So the domino theory is this idea of containing the spread of communism, not necessarily confronting communism and liberating those dominoes and standing them back up that have already fallen, but we can't allow more dominoes to fall, because each time one falls, it puts pressure on neighboring countries, neighboring dominoes. So how are we going to stop dominoes from falling? The plan is to introduce economic recovery, the Marshall Plan. The critics of this will say the United States are using their dollar for a new round of imperialism, that they're using their economic might to create neo-colonialism, some kind of new empire. But the reality is that the Americans are aware of the unrest that grew as a result of World War I and the economic, social, political chaos in countries like Germany and Italy, and therefore they took a vested interest in ensuring that countries were not left in ruins, because in ruins, extreme politics will present themselves as answers to the devastation. Now, historically, at this time, the Americans had been known for isolationism, and Stalin thought that if pressed, the Americans would abandon their allies. So the Americans would retreat back into isolationism. So Stalin wanted to send a message to the Eastern Bloc, and more specifically to the city of Berlin, that the city of Berlin existed at his mercy, and that they were deep within his sphere of influence. So what we can see from this map here is that Germany is divided between West and East, between a British, French, American zones in the West and an Eastern Russian zone, but so too is the city of Berlin. So inside the Russian zone, inside the Soviet sphere of influence, is this little island, a little enclave of liberalism. So the people living in West Berlin would be experiencing liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. And therefore, what was happening was many of the people in the Soviet sphere, they were just escaping into West Berlin, and then they could catch a plane and they could fly out to America. So the Soviets wanted to send a message, the East Germans wanted to send a message, that those people living in West Berlin lived there, again, at the mercy of the Soviets. So they wanted to show that the Americans aren't committed allies, and what they end up doing is they do a classic siege, where the Soviets will close the border between East and West Germany, and therefore no supplies should be able to get into the people of West Berlin, showing the people of West Berlin that their fate is in the hands of the East Germans and the Russians, the Soviets. But the Americans, they want to show the world that they are committed to their allies, but they don't want to run the border, because at the border we have the Red Army, and the Red Army, in terms of conventional warfare, the idea is the Red Army has no match in the world, that they have the power to roll over even the Americans. So what the Americans decide to do is fly over the border, fly in international air zones, and therefore if the aircraft are shot down by the Soviets, at least the world opinion will be that the Soviets fired first. So for almost a year, 321 days, every 90 seconds a plane's going to land in West Berlin with the supplies needed by the West Berliners to stay fed. So instead of showing Stalin to be right, that the Americans are weak allies, the Berlin airlift shows the world that the Americans are committed allies. So this kind of backfires. Because of the success of the Berlin airlift, we have NATO formed. And NATO is a collective security alliance where an attack on one is an attack on all. Still exists today, it's still in the news. And it's the idea that, on its own, there's countries like Norway or Denmark or Iceland or Greece or Turkey, even though Turkey's quite powerful, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, on their own, they are not a match for the Red Army, but collectively they may be. So it's this idea of collective security. An attack on one is an attack on all. Now, in 1955, the Soviets will set up their anti-NATO group called the Warsaw Pact. The 1950s begin with the Korean conflict that we talked about in the other lesson. Again, the Korean conflict, the North Koreans end up invading South Korea, pushing them down to this postage stamp area, and then the UN will lead a South Korea counteroffensive and push the North Koreans up to the Chinese border. Then the Chinese come in and they fight against the UN forces and push them back to about the 38th parallel where everything began. This is an extension of Cold War politics because you have America and her allies on one side and the Soviets' allies on the other. even though the Soviet Union's involvement will be quite limited, it still is a connection to the two worlds, the first liberal world against the communist world. And we also have this added nuance of the UN here, right? This is a UN mission. Because the Soviets were boycotting the Chinese chair going to Taiwan, the UN Security Council voted in favor of an armed peacemaking intervention, and therefore the UN passes the litmus test that the League of Nations had failed. The UN shows that it will stand up to an aggressor, bully nation. In 1949, I should mention the Soviets also have the atomic bomb. 1952, the United States create a new bomb, a hydrogen bomb. So the arms race is being pushed to a new, more deadly limit, right? Unfortunate for the Americans, it'll take about 9 months for the Soviets to match that and have their own H-bomb. The United States will have a new president elected in 1952, takes office in 1953, and what a message to the communist world. We're going to elect our 5-star general from D-Day. Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes president. That was interesting. So there we have the Soviets getting their hydrogen bomb. 1953, Stalin's going to die. And we don't know who the next leader is for about 3 years. That's one of the advantages of democracy, is an ease of transition of power. But by 1956, we can see that Nikita Khrushchev is the next Secretary General or General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and therefore the de facto leader of the Soviet Union. He's going to have his main rival killed. At the same time, he's going to call for peaceful coexistence, saying that, war is not inevitable. So I always say this guy's an enigma. He has his main rival killed, and then says, we can live in, some peace. We can live in coexistence with the West. That, this was a sign that maybe the Cold War was over. There was even a summer of 1957 when American students were allowed to travel to Moscow and meet with their students. So this was a thaw of the Cold War for sure. But during that thaw, there's going to be some important moments like the creation of the Warsaw Pact we already mentioned. We have this idea from Canada. Lester B. Pearson will say that maybe a part of the thaw is a balance of terror, that both sides have an armed arsenal, a stockpile of weapons that is more than enough to annihilate the other. This will lead to future ideas like mutual assured destruction, or MAD, the MAD doctrine, that both sides have the capability to annihilate the other and neither will challenge. Back in the Soviet Union, as mentioned in the previous lesson, we have Khrushchev Destalinizing. This is when he says, for the party's purposes, for the Politburo, it wasn't supposed to be leaked to others, but he says that, Stalin took things too far. The cult of the leader surrounding Stalin was a threat to the nation. We need to de-Stalinize. Well, when the news of the de-Stalinization got out to some of the satellite states like Hungary, they took it as an opportunity to revolt and to try to say, Red Army, go home. But the enigma that is Khrushchev says, I don't think so. He brings in the Warsaw Pact tanks and he crushes the Hungarian Revolution. Again, he's an enigma. He says peaceful coexistence, then uses tanks in another country to quash their spontaneous demand for self-government. 1957 is a big year for the Soviets because they, with Sputnik in October, were the first in space with a satellite. And there it is. Moving on to the 1960s now. In May of 1960, we have a U-2 incident. And this is going to be the end of that thawing of Cold War relations and the beginning of a new, very tense time between the two superpowers. The U-2 incident is when a U-2 spy plane, a high-altitude plane, is captained by Francis Gary Powers, can be shot down. And when it's shot down, Captain Powers will be captured, and Khrushchev's going to freak out, because he now has evidence the Americans are spying on him. At a time when Khrushchev thought that the Cold War was coming to an end, there's evidence that the Americans have been spying upon them. So what happens is Khrushchev is going to abandon the Paris summit, and he's going to storm off. So the Cold War isn't over. Back in America in 1961, we have a new president in office. He's elected in 60, takes office in January 61. And early on, he is going to be in power during the CIA failed mission to overthrow Castro in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs invasion. So this is going to be a humbling foreign policy misstep. And back in Moscow, this seems to announce that we have a president in America, unlike Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general. We have a president in America that may not be capable. So this might be a good time to push and see if we can get more advantages. The Soviets and their allies will continue to see a brain drain from East Berlin into West Berlin. And ultimately, by 1961, they need to put a Band-Aid on that. They need to stop the flow. So they end up beginning in the middle of the night in August of 61. They begin to build a wall. And again, as mentioned in the previous lesson, this wall will become one of the symbols of the Cold War and of a divided Europe. Also mentioned in the last lesson was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Potentially, maybe the most tense period of time during the Cold War. This is when the Cubans, fearing future American attacks, convinced the Soviets to station some missiles on Cuban soil. Well, when the American spy planes find evidence of these missiles, the Americans will freak out and they're going to put Cuba on quarantine status. They're going to board all ships going into Cuba, and they're going to protest against the Cubans and the Soviets at the UN, asking why they have these weapons on Cuban soil. There's going to be a lot of back-channel information, though, between the two administrations. And in the back-channel communication, Kennedy and Khrushchev will come up with a compromise, a diplomatic solution. And as diplomacy solves the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides decide, we need to work on our diplomacy. So a U.S.-USSR hotline will be established, as we see here. Unfortunately, before it's really established and Kennedy can enjoy the fruits of détente or relaxation of tension, he's going to be assassinated. And we're going to have his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, become president. But during détente, there's going to be a series of successful limitations on the arms race, like the Partial Test Ban Treaty will be signed. And other things like SALT and START will be signed as well. But it's interesting to note that it's during the thaw of Cold War tension during détente that's the bloodiest time for the Americans. Because even though they're not directly fighting the Soviets, they're still fighting against the spread of communism as they try to defend South Vietnam against the communist North Vietnamese. And again, that'll be the bloodiest part of the war for the Americans. Back in the Soviet Union, because of the apparent failure to deal with Kennedy, Khrushchev will be retired from office. Not killed, but retired. And they're going to put Brezhnev, a Stalinist, in power. So you're going to have a more authoritarian leader as the General Secretary of the party. 1968 is basically 1956, but we're going to change from Hungary to the Czechoslovakia. And in Czechoslovakia, there's going to be an uprising against the Soviet-style occupation. And once again, the tanks will roll in and crush the revolution. Back in America in 68, Nixon will be elected, and he's become president in 1969. And Nixon's going to eventually pull the Americans out of the war in Vietnam. He's also going to visit China, and he's going to admit China, communist China, into the UN and forever change Chinese-American relations. This is how China becomes a part of the global village. This is how China becomes the economic hub that it is today, because Nixon goes there and has this plan to bring China into the global village. Now, Nixon's going to be caught in a scandal called the Watergate Scandal, spying upon his political opponents during the election. So he's going to step down, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, will become president. He's not really going to be that memorable, but at least under his administration, the U.S. and USSR, they signed what is called the Helsinki Accords, which basically say that they both recognize each other's spheres of influence. Then we have President Jimmy Carter, takes office in 77. He's going to be office during the time of SALT II being signed. But more importantly, I would argue, he's in office where détente breaks down. And détente breaks down when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. So this is going to be the announcement of a new era of tension during the Cold War. Now, the Americans are unhappy with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So we're going to say, you know what, we're not going to go to your Olympic Games. And Canada says, we're not going to go either. And our allies, West Germans and Japan also says it's not going. But look at this, China says it's not going to go. China's communist. And yet they seem to be positioning themselves on the American side of the conflict. Now, because the American public see Carter not doing enough to confront the Soviets, the Americans elect a cowboy president, someone that boldly wants to confront the evil empire that is the Soviet Union, someone that is extremely confident of himself and can breed that confidence back in America at a time where America had a wounded pride because they didn't win in Vietnam. Elsewhere, we have this Polish Solidarity uprising led by Lech Walesa, and it's a first non-communist trade union in a communist country that is questioning the legitimacy of the communist government. And they will be put in jail for their efforts, but eventually he will become the president of a free Poland. As mentioned before, Reagan's going to call them the evil empire in a Star Warsian but also biblical sense. And it's going to inspire in the time of Star Wars this idea that, you know, they're bad so we must be good, kind of a dichotomy or duality in the world. Brezhnev is replaced by Andropov. Unfortunately, Andropov's not going to live long. And then he's going to be replaced by another old guy called Chernenko. So in the early 80s, we have 3 consecutive Soviet leaders that die. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. And at the same time that they're dying, showing the, you know, metaphorical, you know, the illness of the Soviet Union, Reagan gets shot by a would-be assassin and lives. So Reagan is being shown as some kind of bulletproof man himself, whereas the embodiment of the Soviet Union, they keep dying. Reagan comes up with this idea that, you know, we are going to push the Cold War to a level that the Soviets cannot compete. He announces plans in America for Strategic Defense Initiative. The media is going to call it Star Wars. And it's the idea that, you know what, you might have a lot of missiles, but we're going to be able to shoot your missiles down before you get them to us. So SDR are basically this idea of having satellites with laser beams that can shoot down missiles. And the Soviets are going to freak out and say, well, we can't match that. And that might give the Americans a first-rate capability against us. There's Chernenko mentioned before. Now, we boycotted them in Moscow in 80, so they boycott us in LA in 84. So diplomatically, things aren't good here, right? But now, look at that. Things change. Like, you go from boycotting the Olympics to signing a treaty. Big jump here from 84 to 87. So what's the difference? The difference is this guy. This guy is Mikhail Gorbachev. And he will become the last Secretary General of the Soviet Union. He didn't want to be the last, but he was noticeably younger than the others, Chernenko, Andropov, Brezhnev. And when he comes into power, he comes in as a reformer. He wants to introduce some liberalism to save the Soviet Union. He's going to introduce Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost is this political openness, this ability to question the government, some transparency and accountability. Perestroika is this economic injection of capitalism. But unfortunately for the Soviet Union, Glasnost and Perestroika will come too late to save it. But what he does in 1987 is one of those things that will help him win the Time Magazine Man of the Century. Is in Reykjavik in 1987. He's going to turn to President Reagan, who they began as foes, but they have become quite friendly personally with each other. He's going to say to him, you know what, we're going to stop making nukes. You don't have to. You can make nukes still. We're going to stop. We have been making 2 new nuclear warheads per day for so long that we have thousands stockpiled. We're going to stop making them. The reality is the Soviet economy was bankrupt. They were losing their war in Afghanistan, and they couldn't afford to compete. They had been putting guns ahead of butter for too long economically, and they lost the hearts and minds of the people. But it's still a big step. Reagan does his 8 years in office, and then his vice president becomes president, George H.W. Bush. And it's going to be during the presidency of George H.W. Bush that the Berlin Wall will be torn down in 1989. Wasn't meant to be torn down. But the border between East and West Berlin was opened during the evening. And in a moment of confusion and spontaneous celebration, the Berliners united finally. They began to attack the wall that had divided them. This is just changing the title. He's still the leader, but his title changes. He's now the president of the Soviet Union rather than the Secretary General. Germany's reunited in 1990. Warsaw Pact is dissolved in 91. So any of these dates could fit in terms of an end of the Cold War. Key to the end of the Cold War is Boris Yeltsin, becoming the first president of the Russian Federation. And then Russia says, you know what? We don't want to be in the Soviet Union anymore. So then they break away. And when Russia breaks away from the Soviet Union doesn't really exist anymore. And we're going to have this thing happen. All the SSRs kind of abandoning ship and going in their own direction. This was a process began with Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia being breakaway republics. But when Russia decided to break away, then that was the end. You may have noticed that this leader, Boris Yeltsin, when he stopped being leader in 1999, when he resigned, he was succeeded by somebody named Putin. And yes, that's the Putin that you're probably familiar with. So that's kind of a key events look at it. Now we have key policies. We mentioned the Iron Curtain before, in the Iron Curtain speech from Winston Churchill, talking about a bipolar divided world. We've also been mentioning the term mutual assured destruction. It's part of deterrence, the idea of what deters you from acting, what stops you from acting. One thing that stops you from acting is consequences. The ultimate consequence is your death, which is destruction. And both sides are stopped from acting because it's mutually assured that they will be destroyed if they act. We've talked about containment and the Truman Doctrine, trying to contain the spread of communism. We talked about détente, the relaxation of tension. Here's just a map showing those missiles in Cuba. Some Cold War doctrines. The main one's the Truman Doctrine, created with the idea of containment. Other presidents had doctrines too, like Eisenhower and Nixon and Carter. We don't need to learn the content in that much detail. So that, my friends, is a bit longer look at the Cold War.